Right, so best tank class 2021. We're going to look at the best tank classes in ESO. We're going to talk about each class's strengths, weaknesses, the group support they provide, and when is the best situation to use each class. And then at the end, there'll be a tier list of the classes in regards to tanking, which is the best, which is the worst, and I'll explain why. And as I mentioned before, let me stress the fact that it's my opinion. This is all my opinion. So you are more than welcome to disagree and have your own opinion. So this is just my opinion on what I believe is the best, the worst, the middle ground, and the most useful tanks. So we're starting with the Dragonknight. So there's a lot of strengths for the Dragonknight. It's difficult to think of weaknesses in this regard. So first of all, we've got the strengths with the sustain. So sustain is a massive, massive strength of the Dragonknight and one of the main reasons to use them. And sustain comes from the Battle Roar passive, which gives you sustain every time you use your ultimate. You've also got sustain from the Helping Hands passive, which gives 990 stamina. And that makes the Dragonknight the absolute top tier for sustain because they're just able to sustain on their stamina so easily, even while blocking. And that is the important thing to know, it's while blocking. So when they're blocking, they're still able to generate all of their stamina back all of the time. And that makes them just absolutely amazing for sustain. Another strength is self-healing. Now they've got a range of self-heals. They've got green dragon blood, which heals based on the amount of health you are missing. So the lower health you've got, the more healing you'll get. And the higher your max health pool, the bigger the heal will be. So if you've got 40k max health, you're down at 20% health left, you're nearly dead, you use the heal, it's going to give you a massive heal. If you use it when you've got 80% health, it's going to be a small heal. So this is the best way to use that skill. It's a burst heal for emergency situations, and it's an amazing one at that because it will heal you almost to full. And when it does crit, it will heal you to full. And it's just very, very good. You've also got two other options. You've got Cinderstorm, which is another good heal. It's an AoE heal. You put it on the ground, and it heals over a period of time. So you can put that down on the ground, stand inside it, and get a constant tick of healing occasionally, and it will be a nice way to get little bits of healing when you don't need to spend them resources on getting a big burst heal. And then you've also got Cauterize, which it works in a similar way to what's it called? Battalion Defender, where you cast it and it will just shoot and hit people and heal them. Now, it's not a great heal, but if you're doing some content without a healer, it could be a nice little way to do a little bit of group healing as well. So as a tank, use Cauterize, shoot some healing balls at people, and it's another little heal that you could use. And then your main healing ability isn't actually a heal, it's Igneous Shield. So the reason why I've classed Igneous Shield as a self-heal is because it's a massive shield and it boosts your healing. So if you use Igneous Shield before you use your green dragon blood, it will give you major mending, which increases the amount which you can heal. So that is an amazing part towards the DK, is you are able to buff your own healing by using the skill that you should be spamming as much as possible with your Igneous Shield. Another strength of the Dragonknight is crowd control. The crowd control is unbelievable. It's the best crowd control you're possibly ever going to get on a tank in the game. So the Dragonknight has Unrelenting Grip, which is a pull ability. It's not an immobilize, it's not a stun, it doesn't do any of those things. It is literally just a pull. And when you read the description, it says it pulls enemies. It doesn't say it does any effects to the enemy, which means that you can use the chain ability, you can use Unrelenting Grip, and then immediately use a skill such as Choking Talons, So you can use Choking Talons straight after, which is an immobilized skill, and both will work back to back. So you chain it, and then you can immobilize it straight away. And other classes are not able to do that. So when other classes use their other chain ability, it can immobilize the enemy when it's chained in, and then you can't root it in place. So the DK doesn't have that problem. It can chain everything in to one spot and then root it into place, which makes them unbelievable at crowd control. The DK has some damage mitigation passive, so they get the Iron Skin passive, which gives them 10% more, they can block 10% more damage. They've also got Scale Down, which gives 3,300 spell resistance. So they have got quite a good amount of mitigation there. They are very good. If you need something that's going to be able to take a bit more damage than some of the other classes, the Dragonknight is going to be up there because it does have that little bit extra with the extra resistances and the extra damage that they can take. Group utility, they have got quite a bit of group utility. They've got Stagger with Stone Giant. They've got Engulfing Flames, which can be used if you're the only Dragonknight. They've got Noxious Breath, which does AoE Major Breach, which is also good for doing things like ad pulls, or when you've got a lot of enemies, you can just breathe fire onto them, and that will debuff them all with Major Breach, meaning they'll take more damage. You've got Minor Brutality that you gain from the Mountain Blessing passive, and that's really, really good as well. And then you've got other little group utilities as well, such as Deep Breath, which is like an AoE interrupt. So if you've got lots of things that need interrupting, the DK is the best because they can interrupt them all with one button. And then also things like Igneous Weapons are also really good. So they've got some real good group utility. And that makes them just very, very useful in almost any group, whether it's a beginner group or a top tier group. There's something in the DK skill set that's going to make them useful in any type of group. And finally, the last strength is just Igneous Shield on its own. Igneous Shield is one of the best tank skills in the game. It's a skill that you cast and it gives you up to an 11k, 12k shield depending on how you set up. It gives you major mending, which buffs your healing. It gives your group a shield as well, so you get a bit of a shield for your group. It's like a 4k shield for 5 people in your group. And it costs magicka and converts into stamina. So when you use Igneous Shield, you cast it, that procs the Helping Hand passive, which gives you 990 stamina. So it's your sustain tool, your shield tool, it's your group shield tool, it's your health healing buffing tool. It just does so much stuff. You should be casting Igneous Shield as much as physically possible. And that's why you should also run a really high magicka recovery pool on a DK just pretty much for Igneous Shield. So weaknesses for a Dragonknight, it's tricky to find weaknesses if I'm being completely honest. Expensive abilities is probably the most difficult thing. So Igneous Shield is a fantastic skill, but it does cost 4,000 magicka. Your self-heal costs 4,000 magicka. Everything is around the 4k magicka mark. So it does become a little bit of a problem if you cast on a lot of magicka abilities and you don't have high enough magicka recovery, and if you're not using the Mage's Guild skill Balance, which gives you 3k magicka recovery 3k magicka every time you cast it. It can be difficult to sustain casting magicka abilities without that, because they are very expensive, and other classes have similar skills which only cost around 2k magicka. So like the Warden heal is a lot less. Like the DK heal is about 4k magicka, the Warden heal is like 2k. So there's a big difference, and that is one of the probably major weaknesses that you get. The other weakness would be if you are trying to maintain Stone Giant for the group buff of Stagger, which is a good group buff, but it's very difficult. It drops your block on the first cast. So that is a major problem with it. It drops your block. It's also difficult to sustain it, so it costs stamina, and you have to cast it every 5 seconds. So it drops your block every time you cast the initial hit. When you stomp the ground, make the stone fist, make the stones appear, that drops your block. That's a problem. But then the problem also is the fact that it's very difficult to sustain, and especially if you're newer to tanking, you block a lot more often, and you don't know when to heavy attack, it's extremely difficult to maintain that buff. And finally, limited group buffs. So there's not really a huge amount of group buffs. So Igneous Weapons, for example, is replaced by using potions. If you're a new tank, you won't be using Stone Giant. And that kind of leaves you in the situation where if you're not in a stamina group, providing the minor brutality, you're not really giving your group much else after that. So there are situations where the group buffs are quite limiting. You are limited on what you're actually providing your group. But we'll talk more about that in a second, because it's not a huge problem, because a DK is good in so many other areas that make them worth using. So the group buffs, again, we've got Stone Giant and Stagger. That provides about a 3 up to 5k DPS increase per person. So if you're really good at maintaining this and you've got a really high uptime, you can be giving your DDs more damage. Potentially somewhere between 3 to 5k. And it depends how many kind of dots they've got active, how many things they've got hitting an enemy at once. So the more things that they've got that are hitting the target that you've got stagger applied to, the more damage buff they get from it. But it is a very big damage increase, but it also comes with a lot of the risks that we just mentioned before. Engulfing Flames is a very good group buff. It provides 10% more fire damage to the enemy that you've got the fire applied to. The problem is it does require quite a tricky setup to get that to the 10%. So the percentage of the damage increase that it does will fluctuate depending on how much spell damage and magicka you've got. And on a tank, typically it's not enough to get the full 10%. But if you are the only Dragonknight in a group, it is sometimes a good idea to use Engulfing Flames, whether you get the 10% or not, because all damage dealers that are magicka will be using a flame staff in most situations. So they've got multiple abilities that cause flame damage, and Engulfing Flames will buff that. So typically, if you set up as a normal tank, you'll get somewhere around 4% more damage to your group by using Engulfing Flames. So it's still worth using, even if it's only 4%. It doesn't require that much effort to recast it sort of every 12 seconds or so. It's not an ability you've got to cast too often. You can cast it while blocking, so you're all going to provide your group a damage buff by using that. Noxious Breath is the other morph of Engulfing Flames. So if you're not providing the Engulfing Flames buff, you could morph it to Noxious Breath. That will provide an area of effect, Major Breach. So the same as what your Taunt will do, but in a lot of ad pulls, you only taunt stuff with your range taunt. You do a range taunt, you pull everything in, and then you don't usually use your melee taunt, your pierce armor on all enemies during ad pulls and fights where there's loads and loads of enemies. You only usually taunt the main ones, and then you might range taunt some of them, you might chain some of them. This means that they're not actually debuffed. But if you use Noxious Breath, you can just use the Noxious Breath in the direction of the enemies and debuff all of them at the same time, and that'll mean that the damage dealers do more damage. Minor Brutality is a stamina buff, so it's only valuable for stamina DDs. It's no good in a magicka group. It doesn't do anything. You are going to get an increase in weapon damage. So it is good for a group if it's a stamina group or if there's stamina DDs. It's an essential buff. If you're the only Dragonknight as well, very much useful. So Minor Brutality provides a good group buff. You've got Igneous Weapons, which is good for beginner groups. It's good for random dungeons. It provides them with the same buff you get from spell power and weapon power potions. Now, beginner players are unlikely to use those potions, so it's good to use this in those groups to make sure they do more damage, because it will be like they are using a potion almost. So it's quite a handy little thing to use for dungeons. If you're a newer player, you can buff your group, you make them do more damage. It means that you're not dragging out a dungeon over a long period of time because they're not using potions. And also it's good in experienced groups who will replace their normal potions, their weapon power, their spell power potions, and they'll use ulti-game potions instead, and you'll use Igneous Weapons to replace what they've lost by not using those two things. An Igneous Shield, as we mentioned before, it's also a kind of a group buff. It provides a group shield. You can spam it, you can keep putting it on your group members, and it will give them somewhere around 3 to 4k damage shield every time you cast it. So it's nice to help with group survival if you've got really high magicka recovery and you're an off tank, for example. You could stand in your group in a high damage situation, spamming Igneous Shield, spamming it, giving your group constant shields over and over again. So when to use a Dragonknight tank? So the main thing you'd use them for, you'd use them in a stamina group for the Minor Brutality. You'd use them in top tier groups, in score pushing groups for the Stone Giant and the Stagger so that they can do more damage. And they are most useful as well also for beginner groups for the sustain, because the sustain is so good. By using a Dragonknight, it means you're more likely not to die or run out of resources or cause problems for your group, because you're able to sustain because they're so good at sustaining. So that is the Dragonknight. Next we've got the Necromancer. So the strengths of the Necromancer, they've got quite a good bit of group utility. They've got some skills like Unnerving Boneyard, Agony Totem, Empowering Grasp, Colossus. They've got some good skills that benefit the group. And even when there's other Necros in the group, they're still useful. Those skills are still useful because typically the DDs wouldn't be using these skills. So it makes them extremely good, even when you've got other Necros in the group as well. Whereas things like the Dragonknight, as I mentioned, if there's another Dragonknight in the group who's doing stagger and is getting the minor brutality, then potentially you don't need one. So the AoE debuffing capabilities, they've got obviously Unnerving Boneyard, which that you place that on the ground, that causes AoE Major Breach again. They've also got Agony Totem, which gives AoE minor protection to your group and minor vulnerability. So they've got some good AoE debuffing skills, which you go into an ad pull, you use those, and then obviously the Colossus Ultimate as well debuffs the enemies so that they take more damage from the rest of your group. So quite a lot of good stuff in there. Necros are useful in a group even with other Necros. They've got decent damage mitigation. So if you're using the Mender, that takes 10% of your damage. So you get an extra 10% damage mitigation with a Necromancer from the Mender. So when you cast that, that will give you Magicka recovery. So lots and lots of Magicka recovery. But then it'll also take 10% of your damage, which is really nice. They can provide a self-synergy, which is good if you're using Alkosh. Now, Alkosh isn't as important in the current patch. However, if you are using Alkosh, you can use the other morph of Unnerving Boneyard. You can use Avid Boneyard. That provides a synergy. If you were also using Lady Thorn, potentially you could use Lady Thorn and Avid Boneyard to maintain your own Alkosh almost 100%. So that makes Necromancers pretty strong in that regards. If your group is using Alkosh for whatever reason, if you're in a stamina group maybe, that is an option because you are going to have that ability to cause your Alkosh debuff on the enemies pretty much by yourself. So that makes them extremely good at that. And then the ultimate gain is absolutely unbelievable on a Necro. For ad pulls, you should be using... So you've got the skill Necrotic Potency. So when an enemy dies, you can absorb the spirit from the corpse that gives you ultimate, 6 ultimate. When you've got quite a lot of enemies, so you could use your ultimate and then absorb all the corpses with your Necrotic Potency. And it's just so good for gaining ultimate. If you've got like bosses that have got quite a lot of little ads as well and they die and then you can absorb the corpses, the Necro could generate ultimate super, super fast. So that makes them really strong in that regards in terms of their ultimate gain. Now the weaknesses are pretty vital weaknesses as well. Like difficult stamina sustain is a major flaw for the Necro. The reason why is because they don't have any skills that can generate stamina while blocking. They've got one skill. I think is it Mortal Coil. You get like 1,000 stamina over 20 seconds. Something ridiculous. It's not a useful skill. They have no way to really get a good chunk of stamina back on a regular basis while blocking. You are fully reliant on heavy attacking and potion usage. So it's not super difficult to sustain on a Necro, but if you're new to the game, you're not very experienced in the heavy attacking, you don't typically use potions very much, that kind of thing, you're going to have a hard time maintaining your stamina. While also, if you like having to move around in a fight a lot and you're using up a lot of stamina doing that, and then you're blocking, and you don't know how to manage your stamina properly, you are going to have a hard time playing a Necro. Self-healing is situational. You should be using your Mender in situations where you're not near an enemy, so you're going to be losing your self-healing. Now, the self-healing, your main self-heal is Hungry Scythe. That skill is very good. It does a very big heal, and it does a heal over time afterwards as well. If you don't have an enemy stood in front of you, though, when you use it, it doesn't do anything. You don't heal yourself. You have to hit something to get a heal from that ability. So if you are at range from your enemy, it's going to be very difficult for you to heal yourself. So it is situational self-healing. If you're not very good at keeping close combat, or you're not very aware in a certain trial or situation, you could have a hard time with your healing because you are required to be within that melee distance to cause damage on the enemy to get the self-heal. So it can be quite tricky to keep yourself alive in certain situations. The crowd control is a little bit of a weakness. Things like Agony Totem is a fear. So if you chain the enemy with Silver Leash, they don't have a built-in chain ability. They've only got Silver Leash, which is from the Fighters Guild, and that costs stamina. So that's a problem, because stamina sustain's already a problem, and then the only way to chain enemies is to use another stamina ability, which can be quite expensive, especially when you've got multiple enemies to pull in. So that can be quite tricky. You do have Beckoning Armor, which isn't very good. It's a Magicka-based thing, but the way that you have to use it is range taunt all the enemies, and then you have to spam Beckoning Armor. It takes 3 seconds to pull an enemy in, it's got a 3-second cooldown, but you can spam it to pull them in sooner. But it's not very good in that way because it costs too much Magicka to do that. So you've got to range taunt everything, and then keep pressing your Beckoning Armor to pull them in instantly, and it's just far too expensive in terms of resources. And then your actual root ability, you've got 2 roots. Obviously, you've got, as I mentioned, Agony Totem, which fears the enemies, which is not very good. So if you've pulled an enemy recently, they won't be able to be feared. And then you've also got Empower Grasp, which is another root ability, but that does work quite well. And then finally, yeah, like the last weakness is it takes a higher kind of skill level to be really super effective as a Necro. It does require a little bit more skill, a little bit more knowledge about what you're doing and how to tank. And if you don't have that, you might struggle a little bit to play the Necro. If you are really aware in a certain trial or dungeon or whatever, then you might find it's not too difficult. If you already know the mechanics and things like that. If you don't know the mechanics of a fight and you take a Necro in there, you're probably going to have that double effect where you're struggling because you're on a Necro and you don't really know the mechanics. It could be a bit of a problem. So the group buffs that you get from a Necromancer, you get Major Vulnerability. That's from the Colossus Ultimate. That increases the amount of damage that the enemy takes from all of your allies. So everybody who's hitting a boss that you've hit with the Major Vulnerability, with the Colossus, is going to take more damage. They also give the Empower buff. Now this is the same as Gallenway. This is the same that you get from the Mages Guild, Empower. This increases the damage of light attacks by 40% and it lasts for 5 seconds. And you can give this with 1 skill. So it makes it really nice because you can cast 1 skill and that will give the same buff to people that they might get from using a whole 5-piece set with things like Gallenway. So this essentially replaces Gallenway. So that is pretty strong. And one of the main reasons why you also use a Necro, because they're able to provide that, and it is quite a considerable buff. It increases damage by quite a lot in terms of actual, if it's a good group, you're looking at potentially up to 8% more damage that they can do by having Empower on a really high uptime. Minor Vulnerability, they provide that with the Agony Totem and Minor Protection to the group also. They have quite a few group synergy attacks, so Boneyard, Totem. There are a good number of skills that you would use on a Necro tank that provide a synergy, and synergies are typically pretty good because they offer your group other stuff, in more damage, more healing. When you use them, if you've got the Undaunted passive, you get resources. So it's good to have as many synergies as possible in a group, and a Necro does provide quite a few. And if you're also using Alkosh in a group and you're a Necro off tank, you can be providing synergies to the main tank so they can maintain their Alkosh. So that is pretty good as well. And then they've got the AoE Major Breach with their Boneyard. So when to use a Necro? Pretty much any group. You can use a Necro tank. And the reason why is because even if you've got 3 Necros, a Necro tank's still useful because they're providing a different set of skills that you would use as a Necro DD. So they're not really overlapping. On a Dragonknight, if you're using Engulfing Flames and you've got another DK who's a Magicka DD, they would use Engulfing Flames as part of their DPS rotation. So it's useless. Whereas as a tank on a Necro, the skills that you're using generally wouldn't be used by a DD, so it's pretty good. They still have some function and use. And when to use a Necro as well, when you're an experienced tank, if you've got some good experience and knowledge of how to tank already, then it would be a good time to maybe think about playing a Necro and trying something a bit new. Next, we've got the Nightblade tank. One of my old favourites, not so much nowadays, but it used to be a good favourite of mine. Strengths of the Nightblade, they have got good damage mitigation. So they've got, like, a lot of their skills and things will reduce the amount of damage they're taking. They've got minor resolve. They've got minor protection. They've got everything kind of built in. It's all built in. They are kind of well built for taking damage. A strength is they've got the extra bar space. They don't need to use a major resolve skill. They've got that built into their passive. So when you use your self-heal dark cloak, you will get your major resolve. So you don't need to use a major resolve skill, which frees up a little bit of bar space potentially. They are good sustain for experienced players. So somebody who is experienced in playing a Nightblade, someone who's experienced in tanking, will have an easy time sustaining on the Nightblade because they've got some real good skills that you can apply. You can use leeching strikes along with in-cap on your front bar. And if you're regularly light attacking and light attack weaving your skills, your resources are going to be fantastic. Your self-healing's very good when you combine leeching strikes along with Dark Cloak. You've got lots and lots of like healing over time, resources coming over time. They are quite easy to sustain, but they're not when you first start playing them. It's tricky to play them to start with, and you will require to heavy attack more. You're not going to get as much sustain. It will be a little bit tricky to begin with, but for an experienced player who's utilising the correct skills on a Nightblade tank, they are very good for sustaining that situation. And their ability to AoE debuff is pretty strong as well. The weaknesses, like I said, the sustain for beginner players is a little bit more difficult. When you get more experience, it becomes easier because you do need to light attack. You need to be able to light attack. You need to be able to maintain certain skills. And when you start light attacking, they become a lot easier to play. The sustain isn't a massive issue. And when people know how to utilise the skills properly along with light and heavy attacks, they become very, very good for sustain. A weakness is no burst heal. So if you go low on health, if you're going to take another big hit pretty soon after, it's a bit of a risky situation because you don't have a burst heal. The best thing you have got is your Dark Cloak, and that does heal for a lot, but it is a heal over time. So that is something to be aware of. As I did mention though, if you are experienced, again, you will find healing a little bit easier. Because when you maintain all your buffs and all your skills, light attacking and heavy attacking will generate health and resources. So healing and sustain becomes easier the more experienced you are, and the better you are at maintaining your skills. Crowd control is a particular problem on a Nightblade. Yeah, so when you're chaining the enemy with Silver Leash and then you use Mass Hysteria, it doesn't work. It doesn't do anything. So it's not really super useful. It doesn't have such a good effect as the Dragonknight because you can't do both. You can do one or the other. So you can chain everything in, but you can't also immobilize it or fear it. You have to wait for the CC cooldown to finish and then use it. So it's not that great. There is a severe lack of group buffs on a Nightblade tank. They don't really offer anything. And every single group buff that they do is easily replicated or replaced by something else. The only group buff that they do have is their the minor savagery. That's the only thing. But again, it's there is a severe lack of group buffs available. And the final weakness is they are easily replaced. So if you've got one other Nightblade in a group, you don't need a Nightblade, basically. They're replaced by having one other Nightblade who provides the exact same buff, and all of a sudden, they're gone. Group buffs, so you've got AoE minor vulnerability. That's provided by Lotus Fan. So you jump into a group, you can do AoE minor vulnerability, so that's not too bad. But you don't necessarily need it. There's other things that provide AoE minor vulnerability as well. There are many skills that provide minor vulnerability, so it's not something that you really, really need. It's not something that is vital and like absolutely essential. Minor Savagery is the real only group buff that you get from the Nightblade, and this, like I say, would be provided easily by a DD. If you've got one person providing it, this option of a Nightblade tank becomes pretty derelict. And yeah, they're just easily replaced. Minor Savagery is like the only thing that they can really provide. They've got AoE minor main with Dark Shade. That, again, something that can be easily replaced by using a Frost Staff. You can use a Frost Staff. That causes AoE minor main as well with the Chilled effect. So very easily replaced. They've got a ranged Major Breach with Piercing Mark or Mark Target. So that can be quite good for ranged situations, but there's very few ranged damage situations that really exist, so it's not something that's worth playing a Nightblade for. They can provide group Major Expedition with Refreshing Path. Place that down, everyone stands in it, gives them a group buff. So there is a little bit of something there. So when to use a Nightblade tank in a stamina group, Minor Savagery is only a stamina buff. It increases your weapon crit. So when you're in a stamina group with no other Nightblades, that's when you'd use the Nightblade tank. And you'd also be better off being an experienced tank as well for this situation. If you're not an experienced tank, you would probably have quite a hard time, and that would be tricky. Sorcerer tank is the next one, and the strengths are they've got very, very good self-healing with the Clamphia. They've got a Magicka Panic button with Bound Aegis, so you're taking a lot of damage. Boom, Bound Aegis, 40% damage mitigation. It's really good. It reduces the amount of damage you're taking by such a lot, and having it slotted it gives a passive benefit as well. Good sustain on a Sorcerer tank. They've got a skill again. They've got Dark Deal, where they can switch Magicka for stamina. The only trouble is it drops your block, but it's still a skill that will provide you with quite a good amount of resources with very little effort. They've got some good Magicka group buffs, which is really nice. So they are pretty good for a Magicka group if you don't have another Sorcerer. And they are pretty decent in a stamina group as well, because they provide something for stamina groups that's going to help them to reach the pen cap. Weaknesses for the Sorcerer, they are replaceable. So again, if you've got one other Sorcerer in a group, you can pretty much replace a Sorcerer tank. So they're very, very easily replaceable. And this is a common theme with most tank classes, is they are easily replaceable with any other class. Yeah, second thing is crowd control is a little bit rough. Again, you've got to use Silver Leash, which is expensive, and then it doesn't work well when you try and immobilize the enemy after Silver Leash. It doesn't work, so that's a bit of a problem. Dark Deal drops your block. That is a major weakness. So if you need resources, it's not quite as tidy as the DK that can just cast Igneous Shield and get stamina back while they maintain the block. You will drop your block, and it will prevent you from bar swapping and stuff. It is a little bit tricky to use sometimes, especially when you're new. And if you use it at the wrong time, you can die. So it can be a problem. Group buffs on the Sorcerer. Minor Prophecy gives you group more DPS. It's around 2 to 3k more DPS per Magicka damage dealer. And that will provide more spell crit, which is quite useful. If you want to provide your group with that minor intellect, if they need this sustain, you can do. You can use Empowered Ward, and you provide your group with that. If you're using Crystal Weapon, you provide 1,000 more pen. So this is more for stamina groups. Magicka groups are already touching the pen cap, so you don't really need it for a Magicka group. But in a stamina group, that 1,000 pen is very vital. You get that from Crystal Weapon. So that is a very good group buff for stamina groups. And then they provide some group synergies as well with the Conduit synergy from Liquid Lightning. So Liquid Lightning provides a synergy, and that's pretty good as well. So when to use a Sorc tank, Magicka groups that have no other Sorcerer means that the Sorcerer tank becomes very, very useful for those group buffs. In high damage situations, so if you go into a trial where the damage is super high, and you know it's going to be high, you could use this particular class, so the Sorcerer, because of the Bound Aegis skill. So when you know there's a high damage situation coming, you have really high Magicka recovery, and you just cast your Bound Aegis. It lasts for 3 seconds, gives you 40% more damage mitigation, and that's going to be super helpful in situations where you're taking a lot of damage. And also difficult sustain situations. So although Dark Deal does drop your block, it doesn't drop your block for very long. It's shorter than a heavy attack, and it gives you quite a lot of stamina back. So it can be quite good for high sustain situations where you've got to block a lot, and you've only got a few seconds. You can catch your Dark Deal and work that into a kind of a rotation to make sure you're getting those resources back. The Templar tank, everyone's favourite tank. So this again, with the DK, I struggled to find weaknesses. With the Templar, I struggled to find strengths, if I'm being completely honest. So they do have a very good shield skill. And that is where the playstyle of a Templar becomes a little bit tricky. It's not like your standard tank gameplay. You have to play it very differently. It has got some decent group utility in the right situation. And it has built-in minor protection, which can be handy if you need it. Weaknesses, again, the same as a few of the other classes. They are replaceable. If you've got one other Templar in a group, you can replace a Templar tank with that person because they'll provide the same thing. They've got no self-healing. They've got healing skills, but from a tank perspective, there is no self-healing available on a Templar tank. Now, some people like to use Vigor. Some people like to use Breath of Life. Those skills are both useless on a Templar tank because they provide absolutely no healing. So if you take a 25k hit of damage, you use Breath of Life, you heal yourself for 5k. Brilliant. If you take that 25k hit of damage, you resolve in Vigor, you might get yourself 8k healing over 5 seconds. So there is no healing skills on a Templar tank. There's nothing that scales off max health. The Dragonknight has Green Dragon Blood, that scales off max health. The Necromancer has Hungry Scythe, that does the same thing. The Warden has Polar Wind, that does the same thing. Clan Fear on a Sorcerer, they all scale off max health. So the higher your health, the more healing you'll get. On the Templar, there is not a single skill that does that. So you have a hard time self-healing if you ever need to heal yourself. The lack of crowd control is the absolute worst of all the classes. There is no chain. There's no root skill. There's nothing that roots, immobilizes, fears. There's nothing. So you have to use extremely expensive skills and stamina skills as well. This is the problem. So you can use the Fighters Guild skill, Silver Leash, for pulling in. And then you can use the Fighters Guild skill, Turn Evil, to fear the enemies. Now, obviously, the problem we've got there is you're using 2 stamina skills, which makes sustain absolutely horrific. So the sustain on a Templar would be good because they have the channeled focus they can stand in to gain stamina back while blocking. However, all the good skills that you need for crowd control cost stamina. So actually, it makes no difference because the sustain is ridiculously impossible. And then like your main buff skill, so you might use Power of the Light, for example. That will also cost stamina. So everything you do is costing stamina. It's very tricky to sustain if you're not good at heavy attacking. You're going to have a really hard time. Solo situations are difficult on a Templar. If you have to go and do a fight where you stood on your own, you could have a difficult time because you've got no heal, you've got no sustain. What do you do? The benefits of using the Templar, so the group buffs they provide, minus sorcery, which is an essential buff for a Magicka group, provides about a 2k DPS increase per damage dealer, so definitely worth having. You definitely need to have it in a group with Magicka DDs. They've got ranged Minor Breach with Power of the Light, so in certain fights where you want to cast it on multiple targets that maybe you aren't using your Pierced Armor Taunt, so let's say in Asylum Sanctorium when you've got the Protectors, you'd be able to use Power of the Light on all the Protectors from wherever you stood. So it's nice for that kind of thing. And if you range tanking Locustes in Sunspire, you can get minor breach on the enemy because you can just range it with that Power of the Light, while also providing minor sorcery with the same button. They've got AoE Magicka Steel, which is pretty nice. You go into an ad pull, you use Radiant Aura, and you cause AoE Magicka Steel. And that's pretty nice for Magicka DDs in ad pulls, because that will just hit everything. It's like Ellie Drain, except you don't get the breach, but you don't need the breach, because you get the breach from so many other sources now, but you do get the Magicka Steel. So it can be good for helping your group sustain during fights with a lot of enemies. And you've also got the group Purge and Synergy from Extended Ritual. So that is quite a nice skill to have. You place it on your group. It also means that with... it's kind of a group buff. So the Templar is actually pretty good at using monster sets, such as Symphony of Blades, Sentinel of Rakugam, Earthgore. Those are useful sets to use on a Templar tank, because you can place Ritual down, and that will proc those sets onto people. And it's one of the few classes now that has such easy access to use those monster sets inside the group. So, yeah, like you have got some kind of use out of a Templar now with those monster sets that is much more difficult under the classes. So yeah, when would you use a Templar? Use a Templar when you're in only in Magicka groups, and only when you have no other Templar, basically. If you've got another Templar in the group, they're absolutely useless. Warden tanks. Strengths of the Warden tank, they've got great self-heal, plus they do a group heal as well, so your Polar Wind heals you, plus one other person. So if it's a damage dealer that you're healing for quite a lot. And it's based on your max health, so if you heal somebody else, you're going to give them quite a substantial heal. It's really nice, and especially for things like Cloud Rest. They've got some good group survival support, so you've got things like Minor Toughness, which provide more health. You've got Expansive Frost Cloak, which gives everybody nearby in 28 meters, it gives them Major Resolve. You've got a lot of things like that which boost your survivability and your group's ability to survive. They've got pretty good sustain. They've got quite a few things in there that help them sustain. They've got the Netch, which is free to cast, doesn't cost anything to cast it, and will give you either stamina or magicka, depending on which morph you use. And it purges you as well, which is pretty nice. So you get a little free purge involved in that and sustain every second. Wardens are good in every group. Stamina, magicka, it doesn't really matter. They're good no matter what. You can use them in pretty much any group. The strengths, kind of crowd control is a bit of a strength because they do have Frozen Device, which pulls in the enemies. They have Gripping Shards, which immobilizes. So they do have a magicka-based crowd control kit similar to the DK. The only problem is it's just not as quick as the DK. The chain isn't as fast. Frozen Device isn't as fast as a chain. It's a little bit slower, a little bit more difficult to target, but it's magicka. It's better than using Silver Leash in some situations. Again, it's built for Cloud Rest. Weaknesses of the Warden, again, a common problem with most classes is the replaceability. So you can replace a Warden by having a Warden healer, which is mostly the situation that we see. Minor Toughness requires healing to be maintained, so you have to be constantly healing your group to keep up minor toughness. Now, in the past, you could just put Blood Altar down and everybody would get the minor toughness, and that was fantastic. It was easy. Nowadays, you have to use like orbs, or you have to place mushrooms, or whatever. You have to be doing some kind of healing to your group to give them that same buff. So it's much more trickier to get that on all of your group now and maintain it, because you do have to physically be casting stuff to keep that on your group. The lack of balance is sometimes a problem, so because you typically would use Frostcloak for your group, that means you'd lose balance in most situations, so you don't use the balance skill. So if you are in a magicka-heavy situation, it can be quite tricky to sustain in some situations, not all the time, but because you're missing that skill, it can be a problem. And the bar space can be a little bit tricky sometimes because you are required to use quite a few different group buffs. There are quite a few skills that a Warden requires, so it can be hard to fit everything on your bar. So group buffs for the Warden, you got minor vulnerability with Fetcher Infection, major resolve for your entire group with Frost Cloak, minor toughness by healing, just any heal. Use any heal on your group and you'll give them minor toughness, which increases the healing. You got minor intellect and minor endurance, which increases people's stamina and magicka recovery. That's by using mushrooms. You got Polar Wind, which is a group buff essentially because it will heal one other person and it is your main heal. So you'll always be healing somebody else potentially with that. You got Off Balance, which you get from Screaming Cliff Racer. If you're 7 meters away, you just throw that and that causes instant off balance. Your AoE Breach, and obviously you've got group synergies as well with your Budding Seed. Budding Seed provides a synergy for your group. So when to use a Warden in a group with no other Warden? In Cloud Rest. So this is... The Warden tank is specifically amazing in Cloud Rest. They've got so many skills that work absolutely wonderfully in Cloud Rest. So they've got Shimmering Shield, which is a massive shield. It gives you... you don't need to block heavy attacks at all in Cloud Rest if you're using Shimmering Shield. Frozen Device, you can place that on top of the portals and it'll just chain the enemies straight to you when they come out the portal. If you've got you've got Frozen Device placed where the portal is, as soon as the enemies come into the realm, they'll get ported straight to you. They've got Major Mending by using a skill when they're low health, a green balance skill when you're low on health. You've got that. There's just so many things that make a Warden amazing in Cloud Rest, just absolutely worth using if you're new to tanking and you're new in Cloud Rest, you've not tanked Cloud Rest before, this would be a very good option. And it's possible to tank anything using a Warden. Some of the classes would struggle in some situations, whereas the Warden is just fantastic at everything in terms of tanking. So the almighty tank class tier list. So I have kind of rated all of the classes, the tank classes, based on what I think is the best and the worst. So here it is. So number one on my list is the Dragonknight. And obviously the reason for this is because they're just amazing for beginner players because of the sustain. They've got such good crowd control. Their ability to control a fight is unbelievable. they have good group buffs, no matter what the group is, whether it's a beginner group or an experienced group. You've got something you can use to provide a group buff. So for me, this makes them the top tier of all tanking classes because they've just got everything. They're the most well-rounded, well-built class for doing everything and anything as a tank. And even if you don't use the group buffs because your group doesn't need them or doesn't want them or you're not comfortable in casting them, you would still find use for the Dragonknight tank in situations where you might struggle for sustain. So if you struggle for sustain in a fight, use a Dragonknight tank. It's going to make it a lot easier. The Necromancer tank is number 2. And this is more so as a kind of an off tank or something in that kind of way. Because Necromancers provide some real good group support. They provide stuff that other classes don't. They've got use in groups with other Necros. You're able to mix them. If you've got other Necros, you can bring a Necro tank still. You've got skills, provide synergies. You can provide your own synergies. There's just so many things that the Necro can provide that it makes them extremely useful. So I would definitely consider a Necro tank probably number 2 for me in my tier list. For that reason, they've just got so many things they can provide and support a group with and themselves with. So it just makes them useful. But they are, again, like I said before, they can be tricky to play as a beginner, but they're definitely worth investing in if you are an experienced player and an experienced tank. Number 3 is a kind of a tie between the Warden and the Sorc. The problem you've got with them both is they are replaceable. So if you've got one of the Warden or one of the Sorc in a group, they suddenly become quite useless. Now they are very good though. Both of these classes make very, very good tanks. So the Warden has got great sustain, they've got good shields, they've got good group support. The Sorcerer is very good at surviving, very good healing. They provide some good group buffs. So they're both fairly equal in terms of their ability to provide a group with some kind of benefit. And they're both very easy and comfortable to tank with as well. They both have a good tanking kit within their skills. The crowd control can be a bit tricky on a Sorcerer, which makes it a little bit less worth using. The Warden, obviously the main problem is you get a lot of Warden healers, so they become a lot less useful. Number 4 is the Nightblade. It's difficult to pick between the bottom 2 being Templar and Nightblade. Nightblade for me is number 4 because it's able to tank well in terms of the amount of damage you can take on a Nightblade. The problem with the Nightblade is it doesn't provide anything for the group. There's no kind of group benefit from playing on a Nightblade. It doesn't give anything other than to a stamina group, which is pretty rare. And the minor savagery that it does provide isn't really worth playing a Nightblade tank just for that, in my opinion. Last on the list, Templar tank. Now, the Templar tank, when we obviously considered that, the buffs that they provide, they do provide some pretty useful kind of buffs, more than the Nightblade does. But their ability to tank is just far worse than every other class in terms of their lack of healing, their crowd control, their sustain. Everything is kind of negative on a Templar. So even though it does provide some real nice group buffs, the negatives, unfortunately, outweigh the positives of what it does provide. So I have listed Templar as the least useful at the bottom of my tier list. If they were to get one skill that would heal, or a skill that would immobilize as an AoE, all of a sudden they would become probably 3rd on the list. Because by having Ritual and Minor Sorcery and AoE, things like that, and having Radiant Ward as well, when you combine all those things, actually, that would be all it would need to make the Templar tank better, would be to have a max health-based heal, and potentially an immobilized skill. That would instantly make the Templar 10 times better than they are already. And for a Nightblade to kind of increase up the list as well, they would probably need something a bit more juicy in terms of their group buffs. Maybe something with how Stagger works on a DK. Maybe get something like that a bit unique that provides a damage increase. And that would make the Nightblade a very good option. So it wouldn't take a lot to kind of boost these up the list if they could just have those little things changed, basically, in my opinion. So like I say, Nightblade would need something a bit more unique, something that provides a bit of a buff to Magicka and or stamina that might be tricky for, let's say, a Magicka DD to maintain, but it would be good for a tank. Then all of a sudden, they would jump up that list a little bit further on.